fleshing out the mechanisms, but also just be careful because a lot of the arguments you're referring to are just repetitions of some of the things you said in the solvency deficit session. And that's one thing that, like, when I flow, and I'm never, like, exactly sure how to flow international formats, but the way I've decided on is I just, like, start writing at the top of my paper and go down to the bottom of the column. There's no left-right interaction, which means you don't need to say something again and again and again on each part of the line by line. You just need to say it once and make sure it's important. And that'll also save you a lot of time to expand on certain arguments and increase the ranking. That's what I have to second speech. So I think one thing is that even when there's a disagreement about what the motion is, there's a big bias against a round turning into functionally a totality debate. That even if you need to discuss it, you don't want it to be the thing that frames your speech, and this is true for every other speaker that follows. But rather, it's like you want to address this argument almost in a hidden manner. So maybe it's like, I'm going to explain why necessarily, even under their interpretation of the motion, they're wrong. Then I'm going to explain why, under a preferable conception, comparatively better. Or you don't even ever directly say, I'm challenging the motion, but you refer to the arguments you made that were acceptable under your side of the motion, and in explaining why you come first, you're making motional, or like topical, like motion-based appeals. Like, in explaining why, like, X principles argument that should have been made, you say that, and this is the most important argument because it directly answers the question of whether we should regret something, because that's functionally emotional and not political or policy-based. And that's where you are able to make the same arguments and get the same strategic benefit without the optically bad thing of, like, oh, is it a value or is it a fact, is it a policy? I think there are times where you say, I already answered this. I think it's better don't answer it again, because judges will know. And you can just make the answer once and say, he says this a lot, but here's just the one response I'm able to give. That one thing consider doing when you're writing speeches is, instead of like the way you would in an American format where like they see something and you write a response right next to it, like consider writing your speech on a separate piece of paper that is tracking all the issues in the way it should, but that way you don't get bogged down in line by line because you know if something's repetitive. And that also makes sure your speech has a clear structure and outline. And then I think saving more time for this third argument about innovation and necessarily forcing it to be comparative. Like, not just why you get innovation, but why their side necessarily. And it seems like there's the material there for it. Like, non-binding agreements don't provide the necessity and the compulsion to innovate. Second, I think you're doing the right thing with framing the debate about a question as opposed to the fact value stuff. One slight thing about the example is I was thinking, like, maybe I finally would go to the gym if I promised such a big punishment that I can't just say, like, oh, I can't go. So maybe that's just like a choice and example that people might disagree about. But the second thing I'd say is it's good to paint the debate in those terms and consider doing that with political examples and examples more relevant to the topic as well. Like giving the example of, like, here's what China thinks becomes, or here's what the United States thinks becomes. And I think that's something just in general that could have been mentioned in this debate. Like, you at least know U.S. politics. Like, one thing is, like, if it were a binding agreement, Republicans would have to ratify it in the Senate, which they obviously would have. And that's, like, an example. And just, like, fully fleshing that out, like, stories and examples relevant to the topic. Like, yeah. Framing. And I think the last thing about developing countries, I think this is a huge area of the topic. And I think specifically for this that you want to save more time for it so you also can impact Europe and explain why the judge should care about it and how it is. Because it's not just like, this is bad because Western imperialism is bad. There's definitely an element. But it's also there are practical ramifications for, like, do we solve the climate change problem? And I think the strongest warrant was what came at the very end about how developing countries don't necessarily have the economies or innovations at the point where they can develop. That I think that's important. Also, another thing, just like everyone in debate does this, but you will be much better comparatively, is not generalizing amongst developing countries and recognizing that, like, the concerns facing China and India are a lot different from the concerns facing like fast-growing countries on the continent of Africa, like Nigeria and South Africa, and then compared to that, like a country like Uganda. So being able to explain that differentiation also adds a level of nuance to the argumentation, or like small islands in the Pacific. Third proposition is, so I do think, based on how the round is going, that the structure of the speech is good in terms of breaking it down to non-binding, working versus binding, not working, or vice versa, depending on what side you're on. I think spending